Est-ce que tu es dans la présentation là?
Et ouais, quand je vais sortir. All right. So, as you know, Kyle is the head of our customer success team. I am customer success manager in Hivebrite for 2 years already. I've been very used to onboard a lot of customers, some with basic use cases, some with more complex one, including integrations. And when we did some of the project with some of our Swiss customer, we had the opportunity to meet Lionel, who is the co-founder of Arcanite, and who is soon to become our partners to manage integrations. So today, I'm going to introduce you the concept of API. So you need to know that API stands for Application Programming Interface. So API is basically an interface that is used by programs to interact with an application. So as you can see with these 3 images that you have on the screen, you can imagine that the program, that is basically the code written by an integrator, is using an interface, that is an API, to interact with an application. So here we have this little Wall-E robot that you can imagine using the interface that would be the number that you have on a very old school phone, and the application would be the phone. So there is actually no direct human usage of API. It's the code itself that interacts with the application through an interface. An API exposes services. So with Hivebrite API, you are allowed to perform what we call the CRUD action type. So CRUD stands for create. For example, in Hivebrite, it would be add a new user. R will stand for read. For example, get the username of the ID 165328. U for update. As an example, it would be rename an existing object of the platform. And D for delete, for example, deleting an event, deleting a user. And this CRUD action type is actually possible over many, many objects of our database. And you can check all the type of objects you can perform CRUD action on inside our documentation. The documentation is accessible through the link that you have on the screen. So there are many use cases for API, and I try to give you some of the main examples. So an API can be used to retrieve, update, create a large amount of data on your platform, basically doing some kind of data management. An API can also be used to realize one-way synchronization type with a third-party system, or a two-way synchronization type with a third-party system. Of course, Lionel will give you some more explanation regarding this type of action that you can perform with API. So now I'm going to hand over the presentation to Lionel, and he's going to enter into more technical details to explain you everything that you need to know around API.
So Greg, I think due to some of the technical difficulties with Lionel, we're going to have to share his presentation yourself, if that's possible, or I can do it as well.
It's okay, no problem.
And the diaporama.
Here we go. Can you see the screen, Lionel?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So I'm handing over to you. You can start speaking now.
Yeah, great. Can you go to the second one directly?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Gregory. Thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar. Sorry for the technical issues that we are having today. As Gregory mentioned just before, I'm going to present a few use cases that we noticed, or a few ones we were facing in the previous works we have been doing with Hivebrite. My goal today is to go through the two big categories that you see on the screen now. In the first place, I want to be talking about the education, because on Hivebrite, the education is one of the main domains of activities, so it's probably a good way to introduce a few things about the APIs, and also because we have been working with major universities in the past year. One thing just before to start is that as an integrator, I think it's very interesting how much things one can do with the APIs Hivebrite have been developing in the past. And that's partly due to the great work their technical teams are doing and the support they're providing to their clients on a daily basis. So the first part will be about the educations, and also the second part will be about the convenience tools that one can use and the different best practices that are of good use when you're doing work with the APIs. Before all that, I'll just take the time to introduce myself properly. So I've co-founded Arcanite almost 4 years ago now with former colleagues in order to help the companies facing different problems in IT and help them solving the problems. Recently, our company grew rapidly, and it allowed us to focus around 4 main topics that are on the right, that are the web applications, machine learning, data engineering, and hosting. Our team is composed of people originating from the engineering and the research worlds, from one or several of the domains listed here, which ensures for us both an overlap and a complementarity in our skill set. So Arcanite actually is providing technical advices and development forces for other companies that have a specific need or problem. And as such, we mainly produce softwares ourselves, and we try most of the time to port it on the web in order to reduce the compatibility issue, but also to allow the portability, for instance, or ensure permanent access and so on. And what is interesting is that most of the time we either produce or we use APIs ourselves to retrieve the data and to perform the actions. In summary, to communicate between the different tools that we are working with, because nowadays the systems are more and more complex and they are necessitating an integration between many different tools. And that skills are useful because we can provide end-to-end solutions to our client, producing the solution to their needs and allowing also permanent access, managing the entire life cycle, including, for instance, the maintenance or backups or other aspects. What I've learned so far by doing so is that computer science can help us solve pretty much anything if you have enough resources. But one very important thing that I noticed is that, and that anyone can do, is that whatever the scale of the problem you're tackling, it's very important to be well organized. And I also discussed during this presentation the thought process along with the integration examples, trying to share my knowledge and my experience working with APIs, especially with Hivebrite APIs. So I'll start with presenting an education example. So this example is the one I was talking before. So we have been working with large universities in Switzerland with Hivebrite. And those universities are trying to manage an always evolving database of alumni. And as the people are leaving, the users can edit their profiles themselves directly from the Hivebrite website of the universities to indicate, for instance, that they moved or they changed jobs, they had new diplomas, things like that. This is represented on screen by the blue arrow between web request and the user's objects that are on the Hivebrite website. It signifies that users can directly edit their own data if they want. And on the other side, for the university on the left has the database, and the database contains data about the alumni also. but the data usually they are accurate at the time when the alumni finish their studies and can contain information such as the gender, the address, an email address, perhaps, things like that. And after receiving the first diploma from the university, the new users are created in the database of the university, and they should also be created in Hivebrite as well. And to do that, you don't want to do it manually all the time when there is one new user that you want to have in Hivebrite. So you are going to use different scripts and walk through the APIs of Hivebrite. Later, each time they receive a new diploma, the data of the users are edited, and details are going to be added regarding the new degree in the database, and that should also be reflected in Hivebrite later on. So we will also have other scripts that are able to edit the users, finding already existing users, and modify or add new data concerning those users. And to interact with the university database, we are provided an API also from which we retrieve the data about the alumni to interact with the alumni storage system. So with those 5 goals, we had to write a script that would call the provided API from time to time to check if there were new data. And usually retrieve all this stuff through get calls to a predefined URL, the arrows on the left, between the university storage and the interacting scripts. And the endpoint accepts arguments such as the time and date of the last code you did, so that you get only the new data. Then the script in the bottom is formatting all the data and send it over to Hivebrite through Hivebrite API. So we are using 2 different APIs, one to retrieve the data on the left with get calls, and one to post new data to Hivebrite in this use case. This is something which is pretty straightforward for those that are familiar with all this, but can be quite technical and a bit complex for others. Yet, this example suffices to draw several questions that are on the next slide. For example, that what if the first data which is contained in the database of the university is different from the data contained on Hivebrite? For instance, as I was mentioning before, that at some point in time, the data from the university is correct, but it's old data now. The alumni user maybe moved away to a different country or changed jobs or a new diploma, and you want to keep data which is up to date on the Hivebrite system. You don't want to have several databases with user data, some being up to date, some being not. What should we do? Should we trust the user to edit, or should we overwrite with the content of the university database? A second one is a bit the contrary, is how do I ensure that I will not create data twice for the same user? If a user already exists or was created automatically, how should I ensure this is the correct same user which is modified in the future, and I'm not creating a new one when I'm getting a new diploma? All these questions, the solution resides in the fact that you must, before you start working or start working with the APIs, you must have very clear workflow of what you want to do with your data, because the data sources and the treatment of your data is very, very important at all steps of the process. And this is key to the thought process, not necessarily key in the implementation. It is very important if you're about or currently planning to work with APIs in the future, to start defining workflows that are clear, that are fixed, and that won't evolve, because any modification later on will have repercussion at different levels, and hypotheses are made at some point, and you really want to have something that is moving as less as few as possible about the workflows for the data and the processes overall. A first question, which is also interesting, is how should we handle the creation of the new users on Hivebrite side? Because technically is one thing, the user object will be created on the Hivebrite database, but you also want to interact with your users to welcome them when you create a new account. You have a community that you want to manage, and you need to also define the workflow for these kind of processes as well. Hivebrite through the APIs offer you different possibilities, either to automatically send emails on the account creation, but you can also say that you want to have someone personalizing every new email, the email of the creation of the new accounts. And so this is also something to take into account in the processes that you want to define. Finally, the fourth one, which is a bit a tricky question, how should I manage the fact that from time to time my university database is not reachable, or that, I don't know, Hivebrite is having maintenance for some time, even though it's a rare event and quite unlikely. It's interesting, the fourth question is interesting because it's not only with the education example, it's something that is more global when you're working with APIs, and that's a good introduction to the good practices and how to conveniently use the data for the API. This very question I'm going to answer a little bit later, but it's the kind of questions that I want to focus on the second part. I want to provide you tips and good practices so that you could reuse in the future for this kind of APIs in general or with Hivebrite specifically. And here I have 7 different topics I want to address. I'll go through all the ones on the left, except for the first one. I'm providing code examples for those that could be interested if there are more technical person following this webinar. The codes are written in Python and using a few libraries such as request, for example, for the queries to the API. But before all that, the very first convenient tool that I want to talk to you about is the Swagger interface that Hivebrite is hosting on its back office. So Swagger is open source software. It's basically a large ecosystem with different tools that help the developers to design, to build, to document, but most importantly here, to consume the API. And specifically actually for RESTful web services. It's good because it's a very, very good sandbox. I think all the first examples or concepts should try to use the Swagger API that Hivebrite is providing on the back office. And actually it's quite easy to use. If you go to your back office and under the customization, on the next slide, there is the customization panel. Okay. On the customization panel, you have external integrations at the very bottom in blue on the left. And here you can find you have 3 tabs on the top. In the information tab, you have all the information regarding your account, and if you activate the external integration tools, you get the UID and the secret at the bottom. I've hidden the data here. Basically, you have to reuse this as the client ID and the client secret a bit later. And then you can go to documentation, the second tab, and the top. And the documentation tab is providing you all the calls that you can access through the API. So you have the approval, the business opportunities, categories, and so on. And I took a print screen, but there are many more. It's alphabetically ordered. You see the last one is in the M. A very important one is the users one at the bottom. And all of the sections, you can expand them and see you have like 5-10 calls for each of the different objects. And so if you want to use this as your sandbox, what you need is to fill in the API key exactly here. And to do that, you need to, on the first 3 lines, they explain you that you have to use actually another endpoint for the authentication, the first one. So you change the API URL, you click on Explorer, and that gives you a new a new set of endpoints. Actually, there is only one endpoint here. It's the authentication endpoint to get a token. So you reuse the client ID and the client secret that were on the information panel before. You enter your admin email address and the password, and if you try it out at the bottom, you get a token access token. With the access token here, so you see if you click try out, you get the answer, and the answer contains several things in the body. Basically, it says that you can use the API for a week with this token, and there is a refresh token that avoids providing the password the next time. You can simply reuse the token. As long as the token is active, you can create new tokens. So now that we have the access token, we can, just before, you can put the access token as the API key, where there's a big arrow, and you can switch back your API URL on the top, and you have access to all the endpoints, and you can test all the endpoints with your data of your account of Hivebrite. That's very powerful, and that's a very, very good sandbox that I encourage everybody to use if you want to start developing scripts. Helps you checking all the different fields that are required and so on. Second is a short example of the authentication system once you want to script everything. Like once you're done with the sandboxing and you want to go for production or with large amount of data, what you need is to write scripts to use the APIs. As Greg was mentioning before, basically since the goal of the APIs is to automatize things so that users don't have to do it one by one, the first thing you want to do is to reproduce this authentication system, but programmatically. So here, as I was mentioning before, all the codes are in Python. I've been using a caching system to keep my access tokens. The first time I have to put my email address and the password, the client ID and the client secret that we talked about just before. And then if the token is about to expire, what I'm doing is that I'm creating a new token using the refresh token method that I just mentioned also before. And once this is done, I have my new token and I can reuse my token to do all the calls. The next example I want to talk about is about the status codes. What are status codes? In HTTP, basically, when you call for a web page, it says, okay, everything went fine, or maybe there was an error, or there is something going wrong due to the client or due to the server, and this is something you want to listen about. It's basically what is answering to the question I was asking before, when I was asking if the server is going to be unreachable for some time, how do I ensure that I know about it and I do my call once again once it's ready the next time? What I'm using is this HTTP status code. If the status code is in the 200 range, it's a 3-digit number. So if it's 200 or 201, it means that it succeeded, and that's something I want to keep as an information. And if it succeeded, I'll get the data back. If it's a get call, I retrieve my data that I want to use later, or if it's a post call, it will confirm me that the addition of the data was working perfectly. If it's not the case, I want to retrieve my status code and the error message using the request from the API. So this is important, and you see here that in the headers of my call, I had to put my authorization, my bearer token, which is the same token as before. But since I have written the code for the authentication system in the following part, the authorization with the bearer token won't be the token in plain text, but I'll be using the functions that I've developed in the authentication system part. We can see that in the next example directly. Here now on the line 21, the bearer token is replaced by the get HB access token function, which is the previous function. The logging system is also a very important thing in the sense that when you're using the APIs, since everything is automatical and you programmed it, it's going to run by itself from time to time. And you want to have information about how it works. Since we now listen to the status code, we can save this information and we can retrieve it later So the idea is that for every host I'm going to do, I'm going also to add a log object with the status code and the time at which the URL was called. It's on the line 28 here. And basically what I've been doing is that after the request, I'm storing information that I can retrieve later. All the rest is remaining the same. This is very important because if something is going wrong and your script is calling every 5 minutes, for example, maybe there are a huge amount of data that are going to be exchanged, and you want to be able to retrieve what is the problem, at what time, on what URLs you're having the problem after it occurs. So keeping information about the different calls is quite crucial. Next, we're going to quickly talk about the mapping tables because it's also something very important in the thought process when you're calling APIs. There are several ways of thinking about the mapping tables. Basically, if you remember the example with the education, you're mapping information from one kind of database to another kind of database. It's just that you're doing this through the APIs, and the APIs, they are formatting the data in some way, and sometimes it's not the same way they are formatted on the way you're receiving it, that on the way you have to push it or publish it. And you might need to write mapping tables in the middle. This is an example on education. The university database was having a country code for Kosovo, which was different than the one Hivebrite was expected. So if this is this country, we have to change the country code. Otherwise, we just put the country code the same because Hivebrite is separating all the other country codes the same way. This is something you have to do from time to time. Another way to think about it is also differently. We can go to processes. I'll start with this in the processes. There is another example. At the top of the processes example, there is a mapping fields table where basically is that the way you are storing the data is not necessarily the same. The fields might not be called the same that the way it's expected by Hivebrite. Here, for instance, first name might be in one word on my incoming database, while Hivebrite is expecting first underscore name as the field name for the first name. And that's also something that is related to the mapping tables. I have to map my fields from the format they are in my receiving data to what Hivebrite is expecting. But this example is more about the processes. This was just a remark that I was noting on the way. Processes are also important because as I was mentioning, the calls to the API are going to be executed from time to time automatically. And you never know how long they are going to take, but one thing you know for sure is that you don't want to have two different calls running at the same time because they could duplicate your data. So what I would suggest is that you create processes, and if any process doing the same thing is already running, what you do is that you just stop and the call will be done the next time, or the next time it's not already running. And if it's not running, you create this process object to inform the next potential call that it's running and you don't want to start a new one. You have the start date. You can also think about different things you could add next to it. Like if it's running for more than an hour, you could kill it and you could put this process in error, or cron jobs like that going at the same time. This is a full example. Basically, it's the last example we've code for today. I wanted to have a kind of full example as we're using parts of the previous calls. Get new data from the university at the middle is a fake call that is representing the fact that I'm getting my data away or another. And I'm also using the previous examples, the previous codes that we discussed before. A last point about the good practices that I wanted to talk about is in the source of truth. It's to go back to what Craig was mentioning at the very beginning. a good example of use of the APIs is the synchronization that could be either one-way or two-way. And I just wanted to give a bit more details about what does it mean to have a one-way synchronization or two-way synchronizations, and what are the pitfalls that you would like to avoid. Basically, a one-way synchronization is that you're taking the same source of data as the source of truth all the time. For example, you would say that the university storage is always the source of truth, and that all you want to do with your script is to retrieve the data from the university storage if there is a modification, and to push this modification to Hivebrite through the Hivebrite APIs. Meaning, and I'm coming back to the first questions I was mentioning in the education example now, that if a user is modifying the data through web request with the blue arrow, you don't care, and you erase the user data and you replace it with the new university data. This is what you're doing if you know that the university storage is having data which is up to date, and that if this data is modified, it means it's correct and should be replicated on Hivebrite. What you want to do is always the same thing. You are writing scripts so that you don't have to manage manually the data on Hivebrite if you have other sources of data that you're using. I'm using this university storage example, but that could be also the case if you're using Salesforce or if you're using Dynamics, things like that. It's not necessarily something related to education, could work with any kind of domain. The other way around is to have two-way synchronization. That can also be the case. And it's if Hivebrite might process data which is more up to date than your other source of data. In that case, what you have to do is you must have an intermediate system in which you're storing information about the last time you got the data from one or the other of the sources. And with this extra data about the time, you can know which one is the most recent, and thus which one is the most probable correct data. And then with this information, you can pull the new data, so that if the university is providing new data, which is already not correct at the time you get it, you simply ignore it and you don't push it. Okay, so that was quite a lot actually, and quite technical. It's just to give you a flavor of what it means and what is a good thing to think about when you're working with the API. So Hivebrite, as I was mentioning just before, is providing APIs for many, many different objects. I've been talking about the users mostly because it's something that is important for everybody. In all the domains, you're probably having users that are registered already, or that you're storing for a different source of data. But you can imagine doing the same thing with the education objects, with the memberships, with the job posting, with all the different objects that you can manage through Hivebrite. Just as a take-home message, the main pitfalls that I encourage you to avoid, and all the different good practices that are very important to remember. First, I'll repeat it once more, it's very important that you carefully prepare the workflows if you expect to be working with the APIs, because if you know what you want to do with your data and it's very clear on your side what is the source of truth, if you're doing one-way or two-way sync and this kind of thing, it's very, very more efficient and easier to write scripts and to manage the data in the future. On the tech side, it's very important to keep track of everything. As I was mentioning, logging the different calls that you're doing is very important. If something is going wrong, it's way more easy to get back to your logs and try to figure out what happened. Third, the Swagger is an extremely good sandbox that Hivebrite is providing is back of it. So if you have the chance to work with the APIs, really start with the Swagger. You will need to write scripts later on for a large amount of data. But if you want to ensure one call is working the way you're expecting, or if one field is mandatory, the way you should name something, it's very, very good to go back to the Swagger. It has a very well-detailed documentation about all the calls. So I encourage you to use the Swagger as a sandbox. And finally, I suggest you that you enjoy all the possibilities that are offered by the Hivebrite APIs. There are working a lot on their APIs, and it matches pretty much all the objects that you can modify in the back office. So if you're having a large amount of data or recurrent tasks or things like that that you want to automatize, it's probably a very good idea to go through the API. That's it for me. I'll give you the talk back, Greg or Carl, I don't know.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Lionel, for this presentation. It was really interesting. I hope it was clear for everybody, not too much technical. I know we have integrators in the room, so for sure they enjoy your presentation. I'm giving the speech to Kyle now.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, thanks again, Lionel. I had a number of questions come through, a lot of good questions actually. So I thought we might take this opportunity to spend a couple minutes with Q&A. So first, someone asked, they're an anonymous spectator, otherwise I'd shout out their name. What is the difference between SFTP and an API?
SFTP is basically some processes, some protocol to store data as plain text files. So what you're doing with SFTP is that you're having access to a remote server in which you upload data. On the other side, the APIs is a way to call functions that, in this case, Hivebrite, I've been developing to understand what you want to do in order to modify the content of their database. So it's not exactly the same thing.
Okay, great. We've got another question from Lalit Kumar, who said, how can we create a user account in Hivebrite using auth-o or SAML protocol?
I don't know if Greg wants to answer.
Kyle, to me, this is more a question linked to SSO, single sign-on.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure it's the topic of the day, but I'd be pleased to answer this customer in private after this call.
Okay. Yeah. In fact, Lalit sent in a couple of messages regarding SSO, so perhaps we can table that and we'll reach out to you directly. Liza Hess Rodriguez asked, can you do simple integrations with something like MailChimp? I think ultimately the broader question here is, for something that's simple, perhaps there's like a native integration versus leveraging an API and writing code to integrate between two tools. Is there a threshold of complexity where you see users, or customers needing to build out a full integration versus something that is native, and what is the difference between those two?
Yeah, I think you partially answered the question in the question. It's the threshold is a question of the amount of time you're using it, at what point it's easy to automatize entirely, and if it's worth it actually. What is very interesting with the MailChimp example is that, if I remember correctly, MailChimp is also providing an API which is quite easy to use, and in which you could have the basic functionalities of the MailChimp website integrated quite easily.
Okay, interesting. I've got another question here from Alexandra Schiffman, who asked about, is it possible to leverage the API to improve front-end functionality? So most of the discussions we talked about today were around integrating data from one database into Hivebrite. Have you ever seen a use case, or is it possible to leverage the API to kind of transform the front-end user experience? Is that something that is possible or typical in your experience?
As far as I remember, it's possible. But maybe I got more information, but as far as I remember, it's not something you can modify. The idea behind the API is really to modify the data in the Hivebrite database. Yeah,
absolutely. So today, the APIs we have are mainly to interact with the database of user or object that we have in the back office, especially. So our APIs are totally dedicated to the back office.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point because a few folks on the Q&A here have asked about what I think they're implying are do we have native integrations with certain third-party tools like MailChimp, for example, or Zoom, which is the webinar software we're using to host this call today. As it stands today, we don't have a ton of native integrations. It's something that we've been considering, especially as we collect feedback. So it's actually really interesting to hear what tools might be useful to plug in with Hivebrite, for example. One thing that we have done is built a native integration with Google Analytics. So for example, you can go to your back office and insert a snippet of code and automatically synchronize the user activity that is taking place and being tracked by Google on Hivebrite and pull that data into your Google Analytics database and run reporting on how users are interacting with your community. So that's a first step for us in that direction. I think there's definitely an appetite with our customer base and an interest internally in expanding those offerings. Let's see here. I got a couple more questions. John Napoleon asked, does Hivebrite offer webhooks or is polling the API the only way to determine changes in data? That's a good question. As of today, we don't offer webhooks. However, I do know that it's in discussion on the product team for something they're interested in releasing at some point in 2020. I don't have specifics around timeline, but I have been in leadership discussions around implementing something like that. I'd be very curious, Lionel, if you could kind of add a little bit of color to what it means to poll the API to determine changes in data.
That's interesting, actually. The question was very good. It's something that, as you mentioned, is not the case at the moment, but would be a good added value feature. The question is about that if you are calling the APIs, is that you are initiating the call. So you have to decide at what time you do it. On the other way around, you could have scripts that are doing different stuff. And at some point, when something is changing, you have a callback. So it's the other way around. You're not deciding when it's going to be done, but it's a asynchronous process. And when this one is finished, something is going to happen. And that's why webhooks could be very good.
Thanks. That really helps clarify.
Just if I can just add something to your point, we are totally. I mean, we are discussing internally in Hivebrite about the implementation of webhooks for next year. So this is currently not available in our system, but in a short time, I would say during the first half of 2020, we should be starting developing webhooks. So it's going to be a huge improvement with our API.
Fantastic. I think that is most of the questions in the Q&A. So what I'd like to do now is I'll leave the meeting room open for the next 5 minutes or so. If you have any other questions, feel free to send them to me. We'll document this and we'll make sure that we can get back to you and we can relay those questions to your account managers if there's a conversation that is more specific that you'd like to have around APIs within the context of your community. Again, thank you so much, Lionel and the Arcanite team for helping put together this presentation. Really informative, really excited to move further into some technical discussions on a broad level with our customer base. And hopefully this was useful and inspirational for those of you who have potential implementation projects coming up. Greg, I want to thank you as well for helping provide some context around